Mr. Sanjeev Goenka, the chairperson of this convention, Mr. D. Sivakumar, who I think gave an extremely inspiring address, Ms. Preeti Reddy, who's the incoming president of IMA, Ms. Rekha Sethi, the Director General of IMA, Mr. Nalan Singhal, the President of the Delhi Management Association, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would begin by thanking Mr. Goenka for his extremely kind words. And yes, there is a certain sense of déjà vu. I had the privilege of being part of the IMA proceedings last year, this time in Mumbai, and I must say it was an extremely invigorating experience to interact with such bright and ignited minds from all across the country. May I also take this occasion to congratulate IMA on its Ruby Jubilee. It takes a lot of perseverance, a lot of fortitude to build institutions. And I think the successive leaderships of IMA have persevered and have been able to create this into an institution which is not only very widely respected, but adds value not only to the managerial ethos of this country, but to the broader national canvas of interaction, which in any democracy serves as a very important input to invigorate and enrich our discourse as we try and move from one milestone to another. I do have a prepared speech with me, but to be very candid with you, unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to really look at it before I got into the car to come to this convention. And what struck me when I looked at the first page of my speech was the theme of the conference, courage in uncertainty. And so the moment I saw the theme, absorbed it, I decided that I'll do away with my prepared text, which is of course very well sanitized, prepared by extremely eminent people in government, because they do not want ministers to keep making one faux pas after the other. But be that as it may, the theme of your conference got me thinking, and I thought maybe it is imperative that I try and put certain things into a wider perspective from our point of view, from our perch, and then leave it to your judgment to discern as to whether that analysis, SWOT or otherwise, actually squares up and measures up with some of the conclusions that you may come to. If we were to go back to 1991, when the Indian economy started opening up or liberalizing, some people say under the force of circumstances. Others would tend to believe that it was a logical conclusion or a logical continuation of the policies which had been put in place by the government of late Prime Minister Mr. Rajiv Gandhi from 1985 to 89. But 89 to 91 were extremely cataclysmic years for the world. The Soviet Union was collapsing. East Europe was transforming itself. And a lot of strategic thinkers around the world, and in that broad sweep, I include economists also, were proclaiming and declaring that this was the end of history. I remember the famous quote of Francis Fukuyama when the Berlin Wall came down. He wrote a couple of months after that, and he said that this is the end of history. So therefore, you had two competing economic systems which had emerged from the debris of the Second World War. A system which was based upon a form of laissez-faire, which believed in free trade, which believed in multilateralism, which believed in the ingenuity and the innovativeness of enterprise. And then there was a system which believed that, or which held that the command economic model was possibly the best way to distribute the wealth and income which nations and peoples generate. In 1989, or between 1989 and 1991, the latter collapsed. And therefore, in some senses of the word, people who were proponents, adherents, converts, and forerunners of the entire neoliberal economic theory had the privilege, and rightly so, of patting themselves on the back that an economic philosophy which they had espoused had finally not only triumphed, but an alternative economic system had resulted in a political collapse and the reordering of the erstwhile Soviet Union and countries of Eastern Europe. India also had to adjust both its economic model and its foreign policy in order to keep those changes in order to be in sync with those changes. And that consensus, notwithstanding the fact that we had two very unstable governments between 1996, or rather three unstable governments between 96 and 98, that consensus has held the field from 1991, and we are now in 2013. But here, there lies a caveat. In 2004, when the UPA government was formed, we stepped back, we paused, and we looked at the economic landscape as it had evolved from 1991 to the April of 2004. And we reflected as to whether this economic model really includes everyone in its broadest possible sweep. And we came to the conclusion that while there had been wealth creation, there was innovation which took place, enterprises developed, Indian companies not only acquired a global reputation, but had started acquiring companies abroad. Domestically, a lot of people were feeling excluded from that model of growth. And therefore, a recalibration took place. And that recalibration was that we must have growth, but simultaneously and concurrently it should be accompanied by equity. And thereby started the process of creating possibly the most ambitious rights-based entitlement structure which the world has ever seen, possibly after the social security measures which were taken in the wake of the Great Depression in the United States in the mid-30s. And therefore, you had the right to information, the Rural Employment Guarantee Program, the right to free and compulsory education, legislation on forest rights, food security, land acquisition. So if you put this entire panoply of legislation in a certain perspective, it's a truly transformative rights-based entitlement infrastructure to include the unincluded, to bring within its fold the disempowered, which the UPA government has been able to create over the past 9 years. Yes, there have been differences, there have been debates, there have been very vigorous disagreements as to whether we have the ability to be able to fund these ambitious programs. But when somebody in 2043 or in 2050 would look back at these years, 2004 to 2013, and I'm reasonably confident that they would conclude that people who were interested with the affairs of the nation laid the building blocks which ultimately ensured that as we grow, it is growth for all and not growth for few at the cost of the rest of them. But this is not all. This is only a part of the story. The other story is that between 2004 and 2013, the Indian economy on an average grew at about 8.1%. I think those were the figures that the RBI had released last week or the week before that. And I'm not even going to go into a comparison which we usually do when we are more in a political mode. But an 8.1% average growth of rate over 9 years, especially when it was straddled by the great global economic meltdown, the arbitrage, the derivatives, the leverage-driven meltdown, where you had iconic financial institutions tumbling like 9 pins. I don't think, on balance, has been a very bad rate of growth. And therefore, to some extent, if the UPA government can give itself an E for effort, I don't think that E would be misplaced. The reason why I thought that this perspective is important, because when you benchmark the performance of any government, you benchmark it on 5 parameters. And the first parameter, which is important for any growth, any economic development, any progress, is political stability. There was a time in the mid-90s when political instability used to be very much a part of the business lexicon. In the last 9 years, political instability is a term that has receded or faded completely from the political lexicon. The second benchmark is social cohesion. And if you look at the last 9 years in a perspective, leave aside certain aberrations which may have taken place, for example, the situation in Muzaffarnagar recently, or the migration of people from the northeast, from southern Indian cities, by and large, this country has remained socially cohesive. The third benchmark is internal security. And yes, undoubtedly, we don't live in the easiest neighborhood. South Asia, for a variety of reasons, some of them because of historical legacies, has been a region which has been in tumult, which has been in a certain kind of turmoil, not only going back the last 64 years, but if you were to take a long view of history, it's been at the intersection or at the crossroads of many emperors, many conquerors, many other people who thought that their fortunes actually lay in India. But on balance, if you take the regional situation into account, even on the benchmark of internal security, by and by, the nation has acquitted itself well. Economic development, I spoke about, that we've done about an 8.1% rate of growth, and if you compare it with some of uh, the economies around the world, even the producing economies, where the PMI numbers in the last 1 year have consistently been around 50 or below 50, and primarily because the consuming economies are not picking up, and I'm not really talking about the episodical green shoots of recovery which we might be seeing in the American economy at this point in time. 8.1%, is not a mean rate of growth. Finally, on the benchmark of international relations, India today is recognized as one of the emerging poles in a multipolar world. Yes, when you try and transcend from a bipolar world into a unipolar world and back to multipolarity, it has its challenges. But in the last 9 years, to some extent, through the mechanism of the G20, through the Look East policies of the government, the engagement that we've had with the United States of America, the continuing engagement with Europe, not to miss China, the country has been able to position itself fairly effectively in the international arena. But that does not mean that there have not been challenges. In the last 2 or 3 years, India has been witness to possibly the most corrosive discourse which a democracy or any nation could possibly see. There is a difference between criticality and corrosiveness. And I do not hold the media in any way responsible, which is usually the favorite whipping boy of people in government with regard to when you talk about corrosiveness. But some of the actions which were taken by some of our institutions, or especially people who headed those institutions, which is a classical reminder that when individuals decide to go rogue, institutions suffer. That possibly has had the most detrimental impact on the India growth story. And I refer to the CAG's report with regard to 2G spectrum. I would like to take you back to the November of 2010, when the C&AG decided to put out a report saying that there's been a presumptive loss of 1,76,000 crores. As I speak, the Joint Parliamentary Committee, I think, should be winding up its deliberations into this particular aspect. If I'm informed correctly, they were supposed to be meeting today. But be that as it may, the entire genesis of that report was that because you did not auction spectrum, therefore you caused a loss of 1,76,000 crores. 3.5 years down the line, or yes, 3.5 years down the line, or about 3 years down the line, after 2 auctions, what are the numbers that we are left with? 722 crores upfront, which is flowed into the kitty of the government, and a commitment of roughly about 8,650 crores, which is supposed to come in over the next 10 years. And if you were to juxtapose these numbers against the 1,561 crores into the 9 pan-India licenses, it seems the process which was followed earlier, without making a value judgment, actually brought more revenue to the government than the process which was followed subsequently. The reason why I make this point is when people talk about an erosion of business confidence, when people talk about a policy paralysis, I think it's very important for stakeholders in the economic process, and especially those who are very enlightened observers of both the politico-economic milieu, to really measure up, stand up, and be counted when you have blatant aberrations being put out in the public space. It's with a great sense of regret that I make this statement, because when economic numbers come down, it is not only the industry which suffers. The industry, of course, or the economy, takes the first hit. But more importantly, the social development programs, the millions of people who are coming off schools and colleges and are waiting to enter the employment stream, all of them get impacted. So therefore, there is a domino effect which starts unraveling, or which starts playing the narrative out. And if India has to really become from a rising great power to a great power, if by 2030, when the demographic dividend which China has enjoyed starts to wane, when the generation of the little emperors starts coming to age, and India's moment in the sun arrives, I think the only thing which stands in the way of India and that moment is really the very corrosive nature of discourse that we've been witnessing over the past 3 years. And that's why it is hugely imperative that while the government walks the extra mile in trying to unlock those bottlenecks, and yes, there have been difficulties. There have been difficulties with project approvals. There have been difficulties with environmental clearances. There have been difficulties because state governments have not been all that forthcoming, and I'm not getting into a blame game out there. But the reason for all this, if you go into the genesis of all this, is that if you create an environment of paranoia, if you create an environment of suspicion, if you try and perpetuate an environment where you say profit is a bad word, making money is evil, then unfortunately you are left with an economy which is destined to grow at 4.4% or 5% or 5.5%. So that's why it's extremely imperative, and I would like to leave these thoughts with you, that as managers, as people who understand the nuts and bolts of the economy, who deal with real life situations and not take a idealistic long view, when you see apparent in the face aberrations which are going to impact the India growth story, I think there is a moment when all of us collectively need to stand up and be counted. Once again, I would like to thank the IMA for inviting me here, and I would like to thank all of you for bearing with this harangue. Thank you very much.